One of the most significant aspects of culture is its ability to allow human beings to adapt to nearly any environment on Earth. The people who inhabited the Arctic and subarctic regions, such as the indigenous inhabitants of Alaska, had to adapt to a cold climate and a relative lack of resources. After the Paleoarctic adaptations fade away in the archaeological record of this region, archaeologists observe a different adaptation, which they call the Northern Archaic Tradition. This archaeological tradition existed from 6,000 to 3,000 years ago in what is now Alaska and the Yukon. These people were mobile hunter-gatherers who focused their subsistence and settlement patterns on caribou hunting. In this video, I flintknap one of their side-notched spear thrower points while discussing the Northern Archaic Tradition. In Alaskan prehistory, the population seems to decline about 8,000 to 6,000 years before present with the end of the Paleoarctic tradition. After this period, the population rebounds swiftly. While Paleoarctic peoples had a toolkit with a strong emphasis on microblade technology, people living between 6,000 and 3,000 years ago de-emphasized the role of microblades in their toolkits. Instead of composite projectile points with microblades glued into the side, these people made bifacial points with side notches or expanding stems. Archaeologists describe the archaeological deposits left by these people as the Northern Archaic Tradition. Like their Paleoarctic predecessors, the Northern Archaic Tradition people were mobile hunter-gatherers, but they had to deal with a different Alaskan landscape. The last glacial maximum's effects had diminished and the environment was comparable with the present day, such as boreal forests having a similar range as they do currently. While bison were abundant in earlier times and were an important prey animal for the first Alaskans, bison populations were greatly diminished by the time the Northern Archaic Tradition was around. A long, stable climate trend occurred during this period and was good for the caribou population, which quickly became the primary prey choice for these people. This stability in climate caused the caribou to follow the same paths during their migrations in spring and fall, allowing these indigenous people to learn their behavior and master hunting these animals. Northern Archaic Tradition sites have been found all over Alaska, including in some coastal areas. They also can be found in the Yukon and the very north of British Columbia. Northern Archaic sites are very rare on the North Slope and are fairly absent in southeast Alaska, the lower Alaskan Peninsula, and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Basin. Different cultural traditions developed in the southern coast of Alaska during this time. Northern Archaic Tradition points are generally described as side-notched, although there's a great deal of variety. These notches range from moderate in depth to shallow and tend to be fairly open. The degree of openness tends to be extreme enough that I would say some of these points are stemmed rather than side-notched. The blade edges tend to be excavate, forming a triangular outline, although longer examples have parallel edges until the tip begins to form. Most of the bases of these points are moderately concave, although many are flat or slightly convex. Northern Archaic Tradition points have been grouped into two types, tut-to and palisades, but these terms still encompass a great deal of variation, and there's a little discussion of this variation in the archaeological literature. These projectile points were manufactured from a wide range of cherts, many of which are described as Brooks Range cherts. Obsidian was used, and is often found in these assemblages a great distance from its source. Archaeologists interpret that people during this time were exchanging this material between each other, indicating the existence of exchange or trade networks, which did not exist in earlier times. I'm using obsidian for this replica, and this particular variety is Brown's Bench obsidian from Nevada. Quartzite, quartz crystal, and basalt are other stones that would have been used for toolmaking. These projectile points were primarily spear thrower or atlatl dart tips that were used for hunting. They seem to have been used as hafted knives in some cases, but mostly as hunting implements. Archaeologists know that these Northern Archaic points were used as atlatl darts due to some incredible discoveries. Beginning in 1997, archaeological investigations of melting alpine ice patches in southern Yukon have revealed more than 150 well-preserved organic artifacts from the prehistory of this region. Direct carbon dating of the artifacts has allowed archaeologists to ascertain that Atlatl technology goes back at least 8,360 years ago in this region and continued to 1,250 years before present when it was abruptly replaced by the bow and arrow. One artifact that was found during this fieldwork is a side-notched Northern Archaic point still hafted onto a wooden foreshaft with a bevel joint. This foreshaft would have been joined to the main shaft of an atlatl dart. The point is held in place with multiple strands of untwisted sinew, with no mention of resin or glue to hold it in place. This artifact was dated to around 4,480 years before present. Other examples of spear thrower darts were found, including other Northern Archaic projectile points in association with these darts, but these examples weren't hafted. One or two of these projectile points still have traces of pitch on them from being hafted. The Northern Archaic points found in this ice patch were all fairly long and well made, likely because they were lost before they could undergo damage and resharpening. The Northern Archaic Tradition people had a number of other stone tools at their disposal besides projectile points. In fact, the side-notch points weren't the only projectile points that these people flint-knapped. Lanceolate points were also made, though these differed from earlier Paleoarctic lanceolate points by having contracting hafting areas with wider blades. After heavy resharpening, a pentagonal outline would form for many of these points. About 34% of all Northern Archaic sites with notched points also have lanceolate bifaces. Some researchers think that these were the tips for thrusting spears. The lanceolate design would allow for easy removal after an initial thrust, making it easier to stab multiple times. Thrusting spears used as sidearms by hunter-gatherers has been documented ethnographically, including in use by Arctic peoples. While microblades weren't as important to them as Paleoarctic peoples, they were still made, especially at some of the earlier Northern Archaic sites. Microblades were struck from tabular and conical cores. Burins, a tool that is very useful for working antler and bone, are present in these assemblages. Pebbles with opposing notches at two ends are found at some Northern Archaic sites and are unique to this tradition in this region. While they are often thought to be fishing net sinkers, some at least show signs of battering for possibly breaking bones apart from marrow or for making bone meal. Large bifacial knives were produced that could have been used either hafted or unhafted. There's at least some evidence that these were reworked into projectile points after use and resharpening. End scrapers for working hides are rather common at Northern Archaic Tradition sites. At least half of all notch point sites contain one or more end scrapers, with some sites containing numbers greater than 50. These sites with extreme numbers of scrapers may reflect large kills, likely of caribou during their migrations in spring and fall, and the mass processing of hides that would have followed. Because following and anticipating the movement of caribou herds was a primary factor in the mobility of Northern Archaic peoples, they lived across a dynamic range of places. Northern Archaic sites are found in landscapes including interior boreal forests, northern tundra, and upland settings. Visible, elevated places like ridges are the most common landforms where Northern Archaic sites are found. Lake shores and river terraces are the next most common places. Less visible forested areas are the next most common after that, followed by places like glacial deposits, such as moraines, eskers, and canes, beaches, ice patches, and dunes. Elevated landforms would make sense for being choice locations for Northern Archaic peoples to make camp on. High places allow for a better view of the landscape and allow hunters to spot prey. Locations next to rivers and lakes are excellent locations too, because of the proximity to drinking water and the other resource opportunities it provides. Most of the time, people of the Northern Archaic tradition probably lived in bands, small groups of one to a few extended families. During certain times of the year, they seem to have congregated to form larger groups for communal hunting and fishing. Due to poor faunal preservation at most Northern Archaic sites, archaeologists don't have an abundance of data to draw subsistence information from. We know that besides caribou, Dall's sheep would have been the next most common mammal to hunt. Bison, moose, and elk were all limited in their distribution in Alaska during this time. Based on the presence of notch pebble net sinkers, fishing would have been done in some locations. Sites with good preservation show the use of small game, including waterfowl, as a food resource. Unlike the Archaic and regions south of Alaska, the Northern Archaic tradition shows no evidence for increased use of vegetable foods, due to factors of preservation and limited possible edible plant varieties in many of Alaska's environments. There aren't many Northern Archaic sites with the remains of dwellings, but the Agiak Lake site is a remarkable example. At least 55 stone rings are located near the lake in two clusters, with the rings serving as the basis for tents. Stone rings like this consist of small to medium rocks that people arranged in a circle to help define their living space and anchor their tents. The tents here were thought to be dome-like structures with willow frames and caribou hide coverings. The stone groups are grouped in two different clusters, one on the southwest side of the lake and the other on the east side, with the former comprised of 15 rings and the latter 40. Fire hearths are found in the center of the rings, and radiocarbon dates from the charcoal have produced a range of 5,600 to 4,900 calibrated years before present. Additionally, Northern Archaic artifacts have been found in and around the rings. The stone rings aren't the only archaeological features at this site. Two caribou drive lines are positioned on either side of the valley below the lake and are about a mile long each. These drive lines consist of hundreds of stone cairns, also called inuksuit. The cairns, or inuksuit, are arranged in very straight segments, which act as scarecrows and fences to herd the caribou. The caribou were driven into the lake itself, where they were less mobile and could be dispatched easily by hunters in skin-covered boats. The lithic tools at Agiak Lake include side-notch projectile points, unifacial end scrapers, notch pebble tools, and ovate bifacial knives. The scrapers, bifacial knives, and notch pebbles together indicate that hideworking, game processing, and marrow extraction were the primary activities at the site. Lithic artifacts were mostly found within the stone features themselves, with few being found in the areas outside. While it is hard to tell how many people would have occupied Agiak Lake at the same time, archaeologists have done their best to estimate. It is unlikely that one small group occupied the site, building a new stone ring every time that they visited. It'd be much easier to just reuse the old rings. It is also unlikely that all the features were built and used at once, as there is evidence that some stones were used from old features to construct new ones. Based on the archaeological evidence at the site, such as regular spacing between some of the features, which indicates planning, and ethnographic observations of Nunnamuit and Caribou Inuit peoples, 20 to 50 people probably congregated at the site during any given occupation. For a group of 20, 3 to 5 of the rings would have been occupied, while a group as large as 50 would have occupied 10 to 14 rings. People seemed to aggregate at the site for caribou hunting, and probably stayed together as long as food availability supported larger groups. Other times of the year, they dispersed back into smaller bands. It is likely all members of the community would have been involved in the hunt. Those individuals who were not directly dispatching the game would have helped herd the caribou into the right position to be funneled towards the lake and to the waiting hunters. After killing as many animals as they could, or as they deemed necessary, many hands would be needed to butcher the carcasses and process hides and other parts of the animals. Agiak Lake is incredible because of the numerous Northern Archaic dwellings, the immense drive lines, and what the site has to say about Northern Archaic hunting, households, and communal practices. The Arctic and subarctic regions of Alaska and the Yukon are harsh places to live a subsistence-based lifestyle, but the Northern Archaic Tradition people did it successfully for around 3,000 years. Caribou were the focus of their strategy, following the herds and hunting them with skill and careful planning, evidenced by sites like the Agiak Lake site drive lines. Armed with side-notch projectile points, tipping atlatls, and anticipating the caribou migrations, the Northern Archaic Tradition is certainly an interesting chapter in the prehistory of the Alaskan region.